everyone. I'm Linda Nickell, and welcome to the Happiness Hour. My goal here is to help us all connect, inspire, and create. Every week, a new speaker joins us to share a bit of inspiration, creativity, and tips on how you can improve your photography portfolio. Upcoming presentations can be found on my website at lindanickell.com. Under Happiness Hour, you'll find the links to my YouTube channel and our community blog. Erin Randall is a coach here in Austin, Texas, and you can find her at admilyoracoaching.com. Say hello, Erin.
Hello, Erin.
Erin is about to head north herself. So you take off when? This weekend?
Next Friday. So the next time I am here with you all on Happiness Hour, it will be from Montana, where I'll be looking out at the Beartooth Mountains, but you all will see my dad's veterinary magazine collection. You'll love it. You've seen the view before. So, yeah.
Well, actually, I don't know. I just watching tonight, I wasn't sure if I had anybody in the mountain time zone. So get your butt to Montana for us. All right. My guest tonight is Alyce Bender. Alyce is a nature and wildlife photographer whose work has been featured in galleries here in the United States, as well as internationally in countries like the United Kingdom and her sentimental favorite, Japan. Alyce is happiest in the field and passionate about sharing unique animals and environments from around the world, in hopes of connecting people to the planet through her images. Alyce believes that connection is key to promoting environmental awareness and protecting vulnerable species and their habitats. Alyce recently moved to Texas, and she has wasted no time in getting to know the lay of the land. As an educator and workshop instructor, you'll find her newsletter and website, abenderphotography.com, full of wonderful articles and handy resources. In tonight's presentation, 10 Key Principles to Nature Photography, Alyce will discuss and define them and give you tips on how to achieve them. By understanding these principles and how they relate to each other, you can further your photography skills in the field and create portfolio-worthy images. So welcome back to the Happiness Hour, Bender.
Thank you so much for having me back, Linda. It is a privilege and an honor. So I guess, we'll just jump right into it.
Well, wait a minute. I want people to, I kind of like just did a brief little intro, and I always feel like I just got, I just kind of like hit the things that I find like that grab me. So tell me, if I missed something, tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, I know you because you've already, I've actually met you.
Right.
And she's been in my car, people, and she got ready. I'm like, do you want to go? And she goes, yeah, and jumped in. But so how did you get started?
So my photography really started when I was about knee high and had a little 35mm point and shoot camera, and it's how I explored the world as a child. And it's what really drew me to nature in the first place. That was how I went through exploring as children often do. And for me, it was always with a camera in hand. So that's kind of where I got my start, my interest in photography. But then it wasn't until I got out of the Air Force and started looking at it seriously as a potential career. And so I got out in 2013, and I went as a full-time professional nature photographer in 2019. So that's where I got my start and where I'm at today. Last year, I was honored to be brought on board Tamron USA as one of their pro ambassadors. And I'm so very honored and thankful to have that sponsorship. But I've been using their lenses for years and years and years. So it was just an honor to have them recognize the work that I do with their tools. So
well, and guys, a lot of people here in the room already follow her, but if you don't, and I'll give her Instagram later, but it's A Bender Photo. So take a peek at her work, and you're going to see why Tamron invited her to be one of their pro representatives. So, okay, with that, you ready to get started?
I am. And for anybody who might have missed it, have it written down on a slide at the very end. So we'll have
Okay,
that.
great.
So,
Great.
but yeah, let's jump into this. So, all right. So tonight we are going to discuss 10 principles of nature photography. And this is, we've already kind of gone over me a bit, but here it is again. And I want to start off just by kind of going over what's in my bag, because I want to show throughout this presentation that it's not necessarily the gear that is most important. We're going to be talking about different principles, and yes, there are certain ones that I'll point out that there's certain lenses that can help accentuate a particular aspect of an image that you're trying to capture, but overall it really, the gear is what you make of it. And so this is not to have you go out and buy specific gear. These are going to be kind of general principles that can be applied to all photography throughout. All right, so I have my core trio of lenses, which are my Tamron 10 to 24, my Tamron 18 to 400, and my Tamron 150 to 600 G2. Those are my three workhorses. When I feel like I have some extra space in my bag, I will also bring the Tamron 100 to 400 and the Tamron 90mm macro. All of these are used on the Nikon D500 with a battery grip. It is the top of the line crop sensor that Nikon has put out. So I am working with a crop sensor. And then I have a variety of filters, circular polarizer, neutral density trio, which I have a 4, a 6, and a 10 with step rings. And then the backpack that I use is the Alyce Packs Athlete and Adventure backpacks. Absolutely wonderful, small business. And for me, with a female figure and having to carry so much gear, their packs allow me to do that. So, okay, so the Alyce packs, the Athlete and the Adventure packs, it's basically the Athlete's the smaller, the Adventure's the larger. Those I use because they have multiple sizes, very much like hiking backpacks. So I can find one that fits my figure and fits my frame, which is very important when carrying a lot of weight, such as camera gear. It also, both their packs are designed to carry specifically camera gear as well as day gear. So you have things, you have additional space for clothing, trail bars, whatever you need. So if you're looking for a new pack, highly suggest checking them out. And then the tripod I use is a Benru tortoise with a Zomi ball head and an L bracket. So with all the gear out of the way, I want to move on to the 10 principles. And these are not in any specific order. I don't put one of these above the other. These are kind of just 10 key principles overall that I feel are specific, and really, if you can hone these principles, you can hone your nature photography. And so those are going to include your composition, light, color, perspective, timing, planning, slowing down, your impact, exploring, and practice. And we're going to delve into each one of those. So for the first one, composition. We hear it time and time again, whether you shoot with an iPhone or you shoot with the latest Nikon, Canon, Sony to come out. Composition. The rule of thirds. It's very basic, but at the same time, I find it a very important base to set up a image that gives impact. And we'll talk about impact a bit later. But the rule of thirds is very basic. Basically, you divide your image into a tic-tac-toe board, and you try and place your points of interest where those lines intersect. And that gives you your rule of thirds. So in this, we have the fox to the right-hand third, and it gives it some room to move into by setting it up. If I just put it right in the middle, it becomes much more static because there's not really room for it to move into. So the viewer doesn't see it as a moving object. They see it very static. So rule of thirds. basic composition rule. Within composition, then you also have leading lines. These are what help draw a viewer in. Here, this was taken in Iceland, just pulling over on the side of the road, because in Iceland you can do that and still make epic images. But the sky in this was so great, and you had all of these clouds kind of leading to this mountain, and then you had their reflection in the water as well. So you get those additional leading lines down at the bottom, again, drawing the viewer in regardless of the angle of approach that a viewer takes to this image. It's all drawn in, going directly to those mountains, to where I want the viewer to look, because the whole point is to show the relation of these mountains to that little village down there. And so the mountains take up a small portion in this image because you want the viewer to go there. And so by adding all those leading lines, I was able to create that effect to draw the viewer in and bring them in. Leading lines are also important in wildlife photography. Again, leading lines help bring depth to your image and help your viewer see where you want them to see. So in this image, we have the leading line of this foam. It's leading you directly to where the bird is standing. And there's this bright spot there. The eye is drawn to the brightest spots in an image. And so by adding in that leading line with the bright spot, brings you right there to that bird. Symmetry within composition. You know, we say rule of thirds, but you know, these are times to break it. So with symmetry, you do put your subject in the middle, because it's either going to be symmetrical from left to right or top to bottom. In this image, you know, symmetry is used a lot when looking at reflections in water, and that's exactly what this is. Again, in Iceland, this is Vesterhorn in the morning with sunrise, and I timed it so that I was there right as the sun was rising, and that there was a tide that was covering these mud flats, and we had just a few inches of water. That's why you can still kind of see a little bit of the mud poking through the surface, disturbing that reflection. But you got the reflection of the mountains in the water. Symmetry here in sand. It doesn't necessarily have to be symmetry on a grand scale. It can be symmetry on a small scale. So this is the edge of a sand dune. And, you know, the symmetry of the lines, that line going diagonal, working as a leading line through the image, and then the symmetry, pseudo symmetry of the lines off of that midline, if you will. And again, as I said, symmetry is not necessarily from top to bottom. It can be left or right. And so using a telephoto lens while shooting these curlews, I was able to wait until the bird behind and the bird in front that I was focused on both had their heads up. And because they're pointing separate ways, I positioned my subject bird, the one I'm focused on, directly in the middle, and created this symmetry with the two birds. Again, giving depth to the image, adding an additional bit of interest with that bird in the background, showing that it's not just this single portrait image, but giving depth and a bit more environmental life to this image. And I keep saying depth. Depth of field is another way to kind of create, you know, photography is a medium, a 2D medium. And so in order for viewers to get a sense of things, we really need to create that 3D effect within the image. And so depth of field, or your aperture, is one way to create that. By using a shallower depth of field, you can really create soft depth, where a single point, like in this seagull image, the seagull itself is sharp and everything else both in front and behind is blurred. And so by creating the depth, you focus on that subject so the eye of the viewer knows where to go because it's the part that's sharp, but you still have depth within the image because you have foreground and background that have been blurred, but the viewer understands that there's multiple layers there because of that blur. On the other hand, here on the left, you can use an aperture of an f/22, very deep depth of field, to give detail throughout the entire image. So in this image of these lilies in Lily Valley, you have everything from what's very, at the very front of the image all the way to the back, almost all the way to those waves. Everything is sharp, everything's in focus, showing how far back this valley goes, all the way out to that ocean. So, the viewer is able to travel through understanding that these lilies go all the way through that and kind of visually travel the valley through this image. Framing within composition. So this is where you will use other elements to frame your main subject. So both these images with the waterfall, this is taken at Silver Falls State Park in Oregon, up in the Pacific Northwest. And by using the autumn colors to frame this waterfall, it gives the image not only your depth, but it also gives it the seasonality interest. So viewers not only know that the waterfall is the subject, they're able to see it as I saw it framed between these trees, and they know when about when I took the image because of the fall foliage. So it really kind of tells a story while being a rather simple image of trees and waterfall. Whereas this little fawn, I'm peeking through a tree that was, had a V in it. And I'm peeking through that V at this little fawn. And it gives this, the fawn looking at me and peeking through gives the viewer the idea that, oh, they're hunkered behind a tree, just kind of peeking through to see this nature's little, little baby in nature. And so it sets up the viewer to see it as I saw it and kind of experience the emotions that come with, oh, you're walking through the forest and all of a sudden you get a glimpse of a little fawn. With composition, I think one of the things that a mentor, Gary Randall, once taught me that really changed how I shoot in the field is to make sure you're composing not only, say, horizontally, but also vertically in the same spot, because you don't want to walk away and not be happy with a shot or miss a shot because you didn't take the time to do both. Obviously with wildlife, it's a bit harder. They're on the move and things like that, but kind of get it in your head to do what you can to create as many images where you're standing, where you're shooting. If you think it looks good horizontally, try and compose vertically or vice versa. And when, for anybody who's out there shooting wildlife, do the same. If you're constantly photographing elk or deer horizontally, go out and try and photograph them vertically as well. Not only does this give you more options when it comes to your portfolio, but it really helps you continue to grow as a photographer and challenge yourself to see things differently. Because I really think that we all kind of see one way or the other. I know that for me, I see a lot of vertical. Make sure, take the time to see both ways, both horizontally and vertically. I know I shoot a lot vertically, and I really kind of have to, in many situations, remind myself to stop, slow down, and shoot horizontally as well. Just because I typically, I see the world in a more vertical way.
Before you go on
Sure.
from the vertical stuff, there was a question. It was around the lilies. So let me just throw it in there so you can address it now. I believe it's Alden. He's curious if you have a rule of thumb on where you focus for maximum depth of field for a shot like the lilies, the hyperfocal distance. Do you have?
Rule of thumb, I eyeball it about a third of the way into the scene, taking into consideration if I'm shooting to infinity, such as in that, I need to be understanding that a third might not just be a third visually up in the frame, but actually it may be a bit higher because it's a third of the distance I'm trying to keep in focus. So it sometimes is an optical illusion exactly where you need to focus in the frame, rather than just putting your focus point on a third within your frame, but it's actually a third of the distance to the point you're trying to keep in focus. I hope that made sense. So
Yes,
okay,
I think
great.
so. And if not, Alden, stick another question in there if she didn't answer your question.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. All right, so going on to principle number 2, light. Literally, light is the medium in which it is the paint to the canvas for us as photographers. And so we have to work with the light we're given. But at the same time, and I apologize about the dogs in the background.
I was gonna say, is that on your end?
Yes, that one is on my end.
Okay.
There must be somebody driving down the road or something like that, somebody walking in front of the house. There's no such thing as bad light. To me, it is a matter of that there is good and bad subjects to shoot in certain light, but there's no such thing as bad light. And obviously, as especially landscapers, but even wildlife photographers, a lot of times we focus on pre-dawn, the golden hours of the day, and those are great. There's a reason that we love golden light, and that we love those hours. But at the same time, I think a lot of people miss a lot of opportunities to shoot because of, say, bluebird skies. Midday, this was taken, I want to say about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, not a cloud in the sky, but still I'm able to look and find subjects that work for those lighting conditions. If you're having trouble with shooting midday because you're maybe looking for epic landscapes, or wildlife, which a lot of times wildlife in the heat of the day is going to be kind of away anyways, but try looking at, say, macro level, because at the macro level it gets really interesting, and you can make open shade quite easily by just carrying a hat with you. That's what I do a lot of times. And so you can, use the bright light so you can handhold. You're not having to have any extensive setup for macro, but go around and look exactly, what's at your feet. And then you can, again, diversify your portfolio, because then you're not having large swaths of the summer that you're not shooting because it's a bright sunny day out. So find other subjects to shoot that work with the light you're given. Overcast light. I know a lot of people who don't necessarily go for birds in overcast light because they can't get a fast enough shutter speed for some of the in-flight shots that they're used to, but I love overcast light for wildlife. To me, it just gives the surroundings a very soft and subtle look to them, and really brings out a lot of the colors that wildlife has to offer. Overcast days are also amazing for working around waterfalls. My favorite days working waterfalls are days where it's actively raining and overcast, and I'm able to just kind of go out. I don't have to worry about highlights, or dappled light coming through and heating up certain parts, and others not being, others being in shadow. It's just this even lighting across the board, and I'm able to just go out and work and enjoy it. So, talking about light, that's again, very much like composition and light, we all know those two. But within that spectrum, you know, another principle is color. And even if you're shooting black and white, you're still dealing with color, because that's how we see the world. We see in color. And so if you're working in black and white images, you are converting those colors into the black and white. So understanding how color plays a role is very important within photography. If, you know, and we're going to talk about this as if you're shooting in full color, because that's what the majority of people do. The aspects of color that you really want to look for that draw in viewers the best are going to be your complementary colors and your analogous colors. These are just the ones that humans and we are visually drawn to. Complementary colors being colors opposite each other on the color wheel, whereas analogous colors are colors that are directly next to each other on the color wheel. So in here, you know, we have the blue and yellow, analogous being this green and yellow. White balance, you know, it's a part of the color spectrum when it comes to your image. The white balance is going to give you cool or warm tones throughout your entire photo, and can influence how a viewer views the image. You know, warm tones are typically seen a bit. Images that have warm tones are normally seen as a bit sharper. They're seen as a bit more energetic, whereas those with cooler tones are typically seen more reserved and kind of, I don't want to say isolating, but they are just seen as a bit more lower energy. So white balance is important to look at, especially when dealing in tricky situations with white balance, such as when you're working around things like snow, or in summer when all the trees are in full leaf. You can get a lot of really green color cast if you're working underneath a canopy, or if you're in blue sky days. A lot of times that blue hue will come through. And so in this image, this was taken in the Smoky Mountains. And this was on the left. This is the image straight out of camera using auto white balance. And that's what I normally use for my white balance. I don't really kind of bother playing with it in the field because it's such an easy change in post. And I can get it exactly how I kind of see it and saw it there in person. So this is what it looked like, and you can see how absolutely blue it is. I mean, the Smoky Mountain rivers are not known for running blue, and yet this water on the left is clearly blue. It was a blue sky day, and so I had to work with what I worked with. So then I color corrected the white balance to a warmer, bringing out that the water is actually white once more, because that's how it looks when it falls. You know, and bringing in that warmth that was actually there that day in post-processing using Lightroom. Perspective. A lot of things have been shot, and the entry to photography has only gotten lower it seems like every day. More and more people take up photography. And perspective and how you personally view the world and how you personally see a subject is probably one of the biggest and easiest ways to set yourself apart from the crowd. If you can find a unique way to tell your story, to tell the story of a subject, that is going to set you apart from everyone else who is just shooting at chest level, if you will. So here we have, this is a jetty in Japan along one of the beaches. But here we have, you know, I decided I was going to stand on top, take a long exposure looking down. It almost gives it a very time, you know, it almost looks like we're doing warp speed on this thing, the way I photographed it. And this is going to tell a very different story than if I just moved down by the edge of this jetty. It's entirely a different story just because I changed where I was standing. And so how you tell your story through your image is really going to depend on the perspective that you are shooting at. Higher positions offer a very unique way of seeing the world. It's one of the reasons why drone photography has become so popular, is because it gives us a view that we don't see other than potentially if we're in an airplane. The technology has allowed us to view the world from a different perspective, and that is interesting to us. So, here on the bluffs on the California coastline, by taking that higher perspective, you're able to get up on top and look down the coastline, which would be very different than if I was, say, standing on the sandy beach, which is probably 70 feet below us, and looking at the side of those bluffs going down the coastline. So it changes the perspective. The perspective is going to change your story. And in this case, I used an ultra wide lens in order to give myself plenty of room to accentuate the foreground elements here, these blooming flowers with the trail working down, making that leading line to lead the viewer to the bluff to continue down the coastline. So again, bringing multiple aspects of both composition and the perspective to tell the story that I was trying to tell. And for me, probably, I find my stories are often written from a very low position or a low perspective. This is probably one of my favorite flower images I've ever taken. It just always makes me happy when I'm looking at it. I think of a bug laying in a hammock, and this is what they see. These are canola flower fields, and I was able to access the fields. The farmer had set up basically a maze like they do with corn mazes, but here it was before they harvested this canola flower. And by being under, at the ground level, laying on the ground, looking up, this is not a perspective most people see. And so again, it brings that additional interest and makes your image a bit more unique. So more people are apt to stop and take a look and actually spend time with your art. And here's another one from a lower perspective. In this case, I didn't have to lay on the ground. In this case, I was on a trail that was lower than where these flowers were blooming. And so I was able to shoot upwards at them. Here we also bring in the color contrast, the orange and blue. We have the white puffy clouds to add a little bit of texture and interest to the sky, so it's not just a flat blue. I was lucky I got one day with the poppies with clouds. So, but again, taking a lower perspective brought in those other elements and let me kind of cut out any of the additional elements. Had I been a bit higher, I would have started getting other wildflowers of other colors. I would have gotten additional hills, and it would have just been a bit more to the story than I really wanted to tell. It was unnecessary details. So by just getting lower, we get a very simplistic image of poppies and sky, and it's a bright sunny day. And so, and the viewer is able to just take in those details and read that particular story. Perspective, especially in wildlife, means getting at eye level with your subject. Whether that's shorebirds wading through the water, or, you have a swan that's sleeping, you want to get down there at eye level. So again, this is one of the reasons why I spend an awful lot of time laying down on the job, because I like being at eye level with my subjects. It creates a connection between the viewer and the subject when we can make eye contact with them. It tells more of the story and really absorbs people. Eyes are something that, once again, just human nature, we are bound to look for and connect with, because it's the starting of a relationship. We're looking for those signals, those cues between other animals or other people. And so since birth, we're taught to look for eyes, and that kind of tells the difference between animals and plants kind of thing as well. So by being able to create that connection, because you're at eye level with your subject, you're able to bring in that connection with a viewer who, may be viewing your image from halfway around the world, say Vietnam, and yet can connect with a moose here in the Tetons. But when it comes to things like moose, obviously you're not going to be laying down on the ground. You don't have to. They're tall enough. You can, stand up full size and take the picture and still get at eye level. So it's not necessarily always going to be laying down on the ground. So timing. We've talked a little bit about this when talking about, say, golden hour. We're very aware of the time of day most of the time. We talked about how, midday is, many people think that that's not the best time to shoot. It's not for certain things, but there's still things to shoot. So timing of day is important when you're going for certain things. Obviously, you're not going to get a sunrise at noon. So you have to plan out certain shots. If you want sunrise, say, on the coast of Hawaii, you have to be up at a certain time of day. Or if you want to catch the fox relaxing in the last evening sun of a very cold day in Hokkaido, again, you have to be out there at that particular time of day because they're getting ready for a very cold night. So they're trying to absorb as much of the sun as they can before having to go and through a long, cold night. Environmental considerations when it comes to timing, especially when working around the shore, you want to watch your tides. Certain animals live their entire lives by the tide, coming in and out each day. And so if you're trying to catch certain behavior, you're going to want to be in a certain place because of the tide, not because of the actual time of day, sunrise, sunset. It has more to do with how the moon influences the waters. Tides also will influence how you can see certain locations along the coast, whether it's going to be, mud flats or if it's going to be completely covered. So even when working with landscapes, you want to consider your tides if working around the ocean. And this one, again, this is pretty standard. We understand the seasons and how they impact us, whether we're trying for winter images or spring blooms or animals that come ashore during the summer, the rut in fall. It's all about timing. If you are outside the time that those are taking place, you're not going to get the shot. So timing is important to understand. And so in this image, it's not just about timing, but also environmental considerations, because this was taken in January. But the environmental considerations are that this was taken in southern Arizona, very close to the Mexican border. And so it's still warm there during the winter. And these hummingbirds will often overwinter in this area. These cactus bloom throughout the winter in order to provide the hummingbirds with the nectar that they need to survive the winter down there. So again, timing considerations and understanding your subject and how it relates to those timings in order to get an image is critical. Timing of the photo, literally how much time is used when opening that shutter, is also a way that time plays into photography. Long exposures during midday require things like neutral density filters and circular polarizers when working around water in order to achieve the length of time that you want to expose for. So in this image, this is using a 20-second exposure midday, about 11 o'clock during the day. So, that's another timing consideration to take into to factor in. Then planning. So, you have your idea of, you have the idea of a composition, and you understand the use of color, and you understand the aspects around when you should time. Well, how do you put all these together? Through planning. The better prepared you can go into the field, the better images you'll come back out of the field with. Things like location, understanding how you're going to access them. You know, what time do you have to leave in the morning if you want to, you know, stay in Jackson Hole and shoot Oxbow Bend for sunrise? You know, understanding how you're going to access them, understanding the tides, the weather, the transportation that you need to get there. Again, timing and understanding your subjects, you know, whether it's behavioral seasons, the best time of day for certain activity, specific locations, and then the lighting. You know, photo pills is an amazing and rather, I think it's rather complicated, but it produces amazing results if you know how to use it on how to set up, you know, and account for certain lighting situations in certain locations, because you want to look at what your sunrise is going to be, your sunset, your moonrise, moonset, and any urban lighting pollution, especially for astrophotographers. You want to understand those aspects, and being able to plan for that before you actually go out in the field will produce better images on the back end. There's lots of apps, you know, use the technology at your fingertips. Google, the Photographers Emeritus. I use Windy, and well, Storm Radar has now been discontinued, but now it's just the Weather Channel's app that's kind of taken over for it. But these apps are what I use when planning to go out in the field anytime. Slowing down. So we have all this planning, we have all these things running around in our head, and yet at the same time, in order to find opportunities for some of my best photographs, it has taken me slowing down and just kind of going out with and without any particular image in mind. I know Linda's going to love this one, but one of the best tools in my bag is the U-turn. And I don't think enough people use this tool. And
I use it all the time.
I was going to
In
say,
fact, I told you, I said, I paid extra for this car because it does U-turns with any
right?
effort. Mhm.
Right. You know, it comes standard on an awful lot of cars, and I don't think enough people use it. Again, slowing down means taking your time so that when you're going out to shoot and you see something, you can make that U-turn and shoot what you saw. In this situation, I had woken up in Monument Valley and there was snow covering the ground, just, you know, and I knew it was going to die off. And so it was super windy out. And so I shot what I could in Monument Valley, but I mean, literally it was hard to stand up there. So I decided I would move on and try and find something else. And this was just along the highway running out of Monument Valley. And I drove past it and I was like, no, I need that. And so I went ahead and I pulled the U-turn, found a safe place to pull off, and I was able to shoot this image. And between the color combination of the red rock, the blue sky, and the white snow layered on there, with the red rock peeking through, you can see a bit of the snow coming off the edge over there because of the winds were being so high. To me, I just absolutely love this image, and it's rare, you know, it's relatively rare to have snow clinging to the rock in this area. So it's not an image that a lot of people get. The other thing about slowing down is also waiting for the light in situations. You know, if you see the light moving across a landscape, take your time, wait for it, watch and see how it's moving across the landscape, especially if it's like a stormy day and you've got the dappled light coming through the clouds. That can produce some really amazing images, but you have to wait for it and wait for it to hit the right light. You know, right spot, right light in the right spot, and be there to capture it. This is Keyhole Arch, again, down in the Big Sur area of California. And this is one shot that you can only make about from late November till maybe the first week in January. And if you miss it, you have to wait until the next year. Okay, so wait for the light. And in this situation, you have about 20 minutes where the sun is dropped low enough to have the light coming through the keyhole, but it's not below the horizon, because as soon as it goes below the horizon, you lose this golden light coming through the hole. So you have to wait for it. So be patient, slow down, look for opportunities to shoot. And when you do find a subject, work it completely. These are 3 very different images taken all with the same tulip in my window during COVID. You know, work a subject completely. I have an article on my page called Spend an Hour with a Flower. And I highly suggest doing this. You know, obviously it's a bit hard to spend an hour with a bison as it's, you know, moving across Yellowstone, or a bear fishing in Alaska necessarily. But, you know, try and work your subject as completely as you can so that you're not leaving an area, getting to your computer and being, darn, I wish I had taken an image like that or from that angle. You know, that's kind of the worst feeling, is when I get back and I'm like, oh, darn, I missed that. I should have shot from that angle. So make sure you're not coming back from the field with regrets, and work a subject completely. Slowing down to focus on your workflow in the field will also get you, will net you better images in the end. You know, making sure that your focus is correct, that you're exposing to the right, but you're not clipping your highlights, that you're not clipping your shadows unintentionally, that your composition is there. You know, one of making sure that you've done your edge patrol, looking at, you know, not that your composition, not just that your composition is correct, but also that you don't have a stray branch or a stray leaf hanging in the corner that you're going to have to crop out later, because then that crop could potentially change your composition. Try and control what you can in the field so you have to do less work after. And the horizon line, for me, it's a pet peeve to be looking at an image and not have a horizon line that is straight. Some images you can get away with it because there isn't a defined one. But if you're working on the coast and your horizon line isn't straight, I can't tell you how many portrait photographers and wedding photographers I passed up, because when I was getting married in Charleston, I was looking at you know, the profiles of these different, the work of these different photographers, and there was horizon lines that were not straight, and I just couldn't deal with it. So again, slow your workflow down to make sure that you have made your choices intentionally for your composition, that you're not having to recompose in post without actually knowing. You know, if you know that you can fix it and you want to do that, fine, because it doesn't quite work in the field because of, you know, you can't quite get to that position, whatever, fine. But at least know that and make it a conscious decision. Then impact. So I talked a lot earlier about how the viewer sees an image and how you can bring depth to the image and walk your viewer through it. And it's all because you want that impact, you know, that first glance. And you really want to be able to tell a story with a single image. And have that impact, have that storyline that just grabs the viewer and makes the viewer want to know more about your image, more about you as the artist, as the creator, and more about what's going on in the image. So, you know, obviously in this one, we have a fox and an eagle, and the fox has something in its mouth, and the eagle looks like it's trying to stop it by outstretching a wing, because we all know how well that would work. Let me just tell you, spoiler alert, the fox did get away. But, you know, this is one that, again, the story instantly grabs a viewer and makes somebody stop and want to, you know more and explore this image visually and find out what the story is here. Or in this situation where you have 2 cranes facing off. This is in the middle of their courtship display. Again, the story, the emotion, the eye connection between these 2 birds, the posturing, again, it all tells a story. And the more you know your gear, the better it is in the field, because you're not having to think about your settings. You're not having to think about how to work the camera. You can go directly into, how am I going to tell the story of whatever it is that's happening in front of me, and happening in front of my lens. So in this case, this moose is just covered in these mosquitoes, and I was able to get down on the edge of this pond and just be photographing him, knowing that, oh, I have bright highlights. I need a fast stop because I want to capture all the little droplets and all these mosquitoes coming off of him. And as he shakes, he comes up from the water, and being able to know your gear better so that you can tell your story better, because that's what you're going to concentrate on. With that storytelling comes emotion. You don't necessarily have to have an entire, saga written out in front of your viewer. Sometimes it's just going to be the emotion that an image brings. And so, in this, it's the emotion of this big, powerful waterfall. You have this darkness, this kind of moodiness to it. And so you just kind of have this kind of very dark and powerful, broody type image. That's the emotion coming out in the image. And emotion is not necessarily just for landscape, making it that dark, moody landscape or a bright, airy landscape. You can also do this with wildlife by capturing, their facial expressions, and then, allowing your viewer to anthropomorphize that. Here the viewer can often takes in, that this bear, look how disgruntled he looks. He's in the rain, he's got water dripping off his chin. The one behind him has obviously been successful and is eating something, but here he is chest deep in the river, and with no fish to show for it. So, it's that story behind the emotion, just by capturing a certain facial expression, just a moment that he came up and started looking down, because in actuality, his mother was just downstream. And so he looked at her, I guess for advice, or to hopefully have her offer him some fish, because she was doing pretty well too. But either way, just by capturing this image in this instant as he came back up, after he had shaken off, I'm able to capture that emotion to pass on to the viewer. Another emotion that can be brought up is wonder and puzzlement. And I don't necessarily, I think it's, it's obviously not as good as if it's a cute, cuddly puppy. But for me, as somebody who likes to work in the minimalist and abstract, I still find it really great when viewers look at an image and go, wait, what is that? And here we have sand dunes. I don't think anybody would necessarily guess this unless they did a close study of it and could see some of the detail here on the shadow. But what this is actually two sand dunes. The one behind is in light. The one in front closest to me was in shadow, and it had a very defined line. And so I ended up lining the camera up so that it would run corner to corner with a square crop. And using an F9, I focused in just on the ridge, which dropped the highlighted dune out of focus slightly. So you don't have all the details of the dune surface for that brightly colored area. So again, wonderment, puzzlement, that can be an emotion that's brought out in your photography as well. And when we talk about impact, it's not necessarily all about the viewer. Sometimes we need to also understand the impact that we have when photographing. And this is where I'm going to step onto my little, my little soapbox, and really go into the nature first principles. We need to understand how we impact these areas that we visit. This particular image that I took a couple years ago you can't get this perspective anymore. Why? Because it was made popular, and I own up, I shared images from this waterfall as well, but it was made so popular that the area was getting overrun beyond what it could handle. And so the actual environment that we were all coming to, stare at, wonder at, sit in and enjoy was actually being ruined because of the impact that we as photographers had on the place in sharing it. So we need to be aware of how we impact when we share, when we tell others about locations, about how, you know, when we're out photographing and we're stepping certain places, you know, if it's an area that doesn't have established trails, how are we impacting those environments? So once again, impact is not necessarily just how your image impacts the viewer, but the way that your presence in photographing impacts the environment or the subject that you are photographing. So please, please, please consider that aspect as well. All right. So explore. Exploring obviously is a huge thing. It's been put on hold the last year or so. I know for many of us, and many of us are really excited to get back out there as things start opening back up. But exploring, I think, is really important within nature photography, and it doesn't just mean travel. It can be exploring your own backyard. You know, up until recently, I was based out of Las Vegas. Death Valley, 2.5 hours from me, basically my backyard in desert miles. So, you know, I explored Death Valley quite a bit. I've explored my backyard and new home of Texas a lot. But your backyard can also be taking your macro lens out and exploring literally your backyard and seeing how much you have just at your foot. In macro, I mean, a mile can be an entire day's worth of shooting at a macro level. So look at exploring not just as the other side of the world, but stuff closer to you as well. And as the world opens back up, we'll be able to explore the other side of the world too. And I highly suggest it for those who are able to. There's so much to see and so much to do and so much to share and bring back to those who aren't able to travel. Exploring also means exploring other styles of photography, whether it's an abstract or impressionistic work, whether it's working on maybe you're always shooting outdoors and so you decide you're going to explore maybe shooting in the studio by bringing in subjects and working with them in your dining room, your living room, because you haven't really done that and you want to see how that works. And if you always shoot in color, maybe look at exploring, you know, shooting in black and white, vice versa. Exploring things like infrared photography as well. Or if you constantly are shooting landscapes in the daytime, try your hand at astrophotography. So exploring doesn't necessarily mean travel. I want you to look at it as, you know, a principle within nature photography to explore various aspects of nature photography, not just other locations. And then practice. Practice. I think if I had to choose one of these to be the top principle of nature photography, it would be this one. And I say that because I mentioned it a bit before, where the better you know your gear, the more you can focus on the storytelling aspects of your photography. The better you know your gear, the quicker you are to respond to situations and opportunities to get better images, to make better images. So you only do that by practicing. And I think the more you practice, the more you explore your type of photography, the better you can become at figuring out what works and what doesn't for you as a photographer, for you as an artist. And so practice to me is the number one principle that you can do for your photography skills. If I hadn't practiced, if I didn't have the knowledge where I had already set up my camera gear in case wildlife came by. I was camping in Valley of Fire outside north of Las Vegas, and I had my gear sitting on my RV's table, and I had set it up the night before, and I was up in the morning. I had my cup of tea in hand, and I was just kind of moseying about before I got out to shoot. And all of a sudden, this ram comes walking by my RV, literally straight through camp while everybody else is sleeping, pre-dawn. Sun was just barely, above the horizon. We were kind of blocked by it, so it was this soft light. And all of a sudden, everything just kicked in. I didn't have to think about it. I grabbed my camera, popped out of my RV as quiet as I could in my pajamas, and was able to capture this image of him looking at me, backed by the red rocks of Valley of Fire, surrounded by the brush, and just capturing a great environmental portrait of this ram that happened to walk by my RV early morning while I was drinking my tea. And I didn't have to think about settings. I didn't have to think about what I was doing. All I had to do was think about the story and how I wanted to capture them, and how I had maybe 60 seconds to do it, because a few more steps and he was up over beyond this ridge and down beyond where I could photograph him. So again, practicing is, practice makes perfect. And we'll never, we're always growing. There's not necessarily a perfect image out there, so we have to keep practicing. It's the key to growing your portfolio as a nature photographer. So with that, I thank you all so very, very much for joining me tonight. I'd love to open it up to any questions we have, and feel free to visit me over at abenderphotography.com /subscribe if you'd like to sign up for my monthly newsletter, where I send out a new article. I update you on any events, workshops, photo adventures, or webinars I have coming up. And of course, I also give you some of the latest images. I'm also on Instagram at abenderphoto. And once again, special thank you to Tamron for their continued support.
Sounds great. Okay, I'm going to get you to stop sharing your screen for a second. Just a couple of questions, and I'll look and make sure I didn't miss anything. This goes back, and Deborah sent her message just as you jumped to the next thing. So I kind of missed it. So the timing, I didn't want to interrupt. But you had a photo of the bear in the water, and then later you had one of the moose in the water. And she was curious, how did that bear image happen? How did that come together? Were you in the water with waders, or?
No, so I was set up on the rocks across the river. This was a family of, it was a mother and 3 older cubs. The 2 in the image were the 2 older cubs, and they kind of had a routine to come down to the river each day. And while I was in Alaska, we spent probably 16 hours at the river over 5 days, watching them feed and fish and things. And so we were just set up. It was me and a group of 3 others that were set up on the rocks across the water from where they were, across the banks. But I was very low. I was a couple times my butt did get wet because the river came up over the rock I was sitting on. So I was very low, but I wasn't actually in the river. The moose, I was laying down on the mud bank of the pond that it was there. So again, getting very, very low to get at water level, to get at eye level with those animals.
Perfect. So Alden has a question about, he wants to know, do you ever go backpacking with your gear? And if so, he's curious about, does your gear kit change?
So I do go backpacking with my gear, not as extensively as I once did, but I do that core trio that I mentioned at the very beginning, my Tamron 10 to 24, my Tamron 18 to 400, and my Tamron 150 to 600 typically go with me everywhere. And so those are the three that I'll carry with me. My kit does not really change unless I'm just kind of local, in which case I'll leave some lenses at home, because if it's local, I typically will go back. But like the 18 to 400 is an amazing lens because I can do so much with it. So I rarely leave that one at home, because even if I only take that one and say my 150 to 600, because I'm expecting to be photographing birds all day, I still have that 18 to 400 in my bag. So if we come across a landscape image that I really want to shoot, I can change lenses and get it with that. And you know, whether I need to take a few shots in order to get kind of the ultra wide look and put it together in post, I can do that. But most of the time, I find that carrying those three lenses with me, that works for all situations.
Okay. As I always do, I'm going to share the chat comments with you via email, because there are quite, I mean, you've been doing this for a little while and your photography is wonderful. I've told you that in person, but it's really nice to see people say it. So I'm going to share the text with you. There is one question, and I knew it was going to be in there. So how did you become how did Tamron find you? How did that work out?
That's a really great question, and I don't really know the answer to it. It was during my first year full-time as a full-time professional photographer, and I was networking like never before. And so, you know, on social media, I would tag them because those are the lenses I use. In person at my local camera store, where I started out teaching at BNC Camera in Las Vegas. That's where I started out doing some teaching, and I met their rep there. And then I went to WPPI, which is a event expo that's held here in Vegas as well. And I stopped by the Tamron booth, talked to them. That's actually where I purchased my 18 to 400. And, you know, so there was a lot, I had a lot of interaction with Tamron on multiple levels. At the WPPI, I was showing off some of my work that I did with their lenses, and they said, hey, email so-and-so and see if you can see if there's any interest in your images to be published in the Tamron magazine. I did. They used some of my images for an article in the magazine that year, and that got the attention, from what I understand, that got the attention of the higher ups, and so I was then offered to be brought on board as their ambassador. Every story I've found for ambassadors, regardless of brand, are typically very individual. Rarely is there just a application process where you go, hey, here's my portfolio, here's my Instagram, you know, look, you know, hit me up if you're interested, kind of thing. So it really does, you know, the brands have their own way kind of on that side of the house that they suss out who they want. So I don't really have a clearer answer. That's just my story.
That's a great story. It's a wonderful story. All right, Bender. Thank you for doing this. Oh my goodness. This was such a, you know, when you start talking about the 10 of anything and you start rolling through it, and I mean, some of these things, oh yeah, I know this, but it was a nice reminder to look at some of the ones that I don't do very well, like slow down. And a perfect example of that was recently you and I were on our way to look for birds, because I had a mission to go look for songbirds that were migrating through the Gulf Coast, and I kind of threw it out there and said, do you want to go? And it was an early morning and it was a long drive. So
that was.
It was a long drive. People, when I invite you to do stuff, you need to ask all the questions, because you may get stuck in the car with me for 5 hours one way. That was one way. And I remember I'm flying pretty fast, and I'm thinking, God, that's a really big egret. really big egret at not the speed limit I was going. And I was like, that's a big bird. And she says, well, you know, it's a crane. It's a crane. And I'm like, it's not, it's early morning. My brain is still not connecting to, what do you mean it's a crane? It's an egret. And then she's like, you know, one of the, you know, an endangered species, that one of the biggest birds in North America. And I'm like, is that a whooping crane? And she says, yeah, I've been saying that. And I'm like, wow, I'm making a U-turn. And
Yeah.
I U-turned, we pulled over and we creeped up to the fence, and she is crouching this whole time. And I'm thinking, my knees do not do what hers are doing. But we spent a long time with those birds.
Long enough to have the sheriff stop.
What? Don't tell them that.
He was very informative, though. He was super interested, and he was very informative as to what type of rice patty that they were feeding in. It was a crawfish patty at that time.
Yeah,
I found it very interesting.
I did too. He was great. But you don't know this. There's a few people in this room that might, but I've been blamed for anytime we're out and about and the police show up, I'm the common denominator. And I'm like, here's more evidence of that. But we had a great time. And when you start when I started, you know, listening to, yeah, rule thirds, that, you know, those things click. Yes, those are things, fundamentals that you learn right off the bat. But it's so nice to come back and hear them again, and with your take on them and your explanations. So it was a beautiful presentation, and it was just amplified with the images that you shared with us. So thank you very much for doing this, because I know how busy you are, and for you to put this on your calendar and do this for my group. When I say my group, and friends that are in this room, heartfelt thanks for sharing what
anytime.
You know.
Seriously,
Yeah.
We'll have to get back on the calendar.
You will. I cornered her in the car, so yeah, she'll come back. So yeah. All right, guys.
But thank you all so very much for joining us tonight.
Yes. Thank you. You guys, you can connect with Alyce through her website, abenderphotography.com. And if you're on Instagram, look for her at abenderphoto. I'll link all of her socials in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, she started talking about taking an hour with a flower. And if we rewind, that's how I found her and invited her to come to speak to us back in late August. I had read that article and I thought, I kind of like this. I wonder if this girl would come and share what she knows. And she did. So that presentation is called Macro Photography, Focus on the Small Things in Life. And you can find that on the YouTube channel by searching for Linda Nickell's Happiness Hour. So if you haven't checked out the Happiness Hour community blog, I'd like to invite you to take a peek. And if you'd like to contribute an article, just take a look at the invitation on my website for details. We are off next week. I'm going to be stomping through the Pacific Northwest myself. Erin is on her way to Montana. Elaine, I think, is still down in on the tip of the South Texas border, laying out and fishing and doing the things that you do on the coast. But we're going to take next week off. But we will be back on Wednesday, June 2nd, with Sim Mahanta and his presentation called Photography Outside Golden Hour. And until next time, go out and create something beautiful. And I hope that we see you again soon.